The moment Camille Harris touched the battered keys of the forgotten upright piano, the world inside the New Haven Conservatory froze. In a room built to worship polished perfection, it wasn't a flawless technique that stopped hearts, it was raw truth bleeding from every trembling note. That morning, a woman who had spent 13 years cleaning floors was about to make the entire hall hold its breath and listen. The New Haven Conservatory in the early morning was a different world, one wrapped in fog and heavy silence. The tall windows overlooking the stone courtyard were always misted over at this hour, blurring the ivy-covered walls and casting muted gray light across the polished marble floors. It was here, in the hush before the day began, that Camille Harris found her peace. Pushing her cart of cleaning supplies down the deserted corridors, she moved like a ghost, her worn sneakers silent against the ground, her hands roughened from years of scrubbing and polishing. Camille had worked these halls for 13 years, blending into the background like a shadow that never left a trace. To the students and faculty, she was invisible, another fixture of maintenance, as much a part of the scenery as the chandeliers and the grand pianos she meticulously dusted but never dared to touch. Born in Baton Rouge, Camille had once lived a different life, or at least, held a different dream. As a child, she would sneak into the Blue Note Lounge after closing hours, watching Mr. Lionel Jacobs, an old jazz musician with hands like braided oak, coax life out of a battered upright piano in the corner. Her mother, a waitress at the lounge, would let Camille sit quietly in the shadows, humming along with the slow, smoky ballads Lionel played. It was there, between the clink of empty glasses and the low murmur of tired laughter, that Camille first touched the keys, her small fingers trembling with the enormity of the sound they could create. Lionel taught her not through sheet music or theory, but through stories woven into chords, sorrow tucked between melodies, hope stitched into every improvisation. "Music's not in the notes, child," he'd say, tapping his chest. "It's in here. If you can't play from here, you ain't playing at all." But dreams, Camille learned early, had a way of being smothered under the heavy blanket of poverty. Her mother's illness came swift and brutal, bills stacking higher than the paychecks could match, and Camille, just 16, traded in piano lessons for night shifts cleaning offices. The music, once burning bright inside her, was packed away like an old photograph, too painful to look at, too precious to throw away. She promised herself she would come back to it one day. But one day turned into years. Years turned into decades. On a particularly bitter winter morning, Camille pushed open the heavy oak doors of the East Hall. The grand Steinway Model D sat at the far end, its black lacquer gleaming under the muted lights. She moved toward it reverently, her cloth folded neatly in her hand. As she polished the piano's surface, she didn't dare glance at the keys. Touching them felt forbidden, like trespassing into a world that was never meant for her. The moment shattered when a voice rang out behind her, sharp and sneering. "Careful with that, would you?" Camille turned to see Landon Mercer leaning casually against the doorway, a smirk playing on his lips. He wore a tailored cashmere coat, a silk scarf thrown around his neck as if he had just stepped out of a photo shoot for privilege itself. His father, a titan of the entertainment world, had donated an entire wing to the conservatory, and Landon carried himself like he owned every inch of it. "You probably think a piano is just another table to wipe down," he added, laughing under his breath. "Tell you what. Try it out if you really think you belong here." The words hit harder than any shove. Camille felt her cheeks burn, but she said nothing, lowering her eyes to the floor, clutching the cloth so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Landon lingered a moment longer, waiting for a reaction that never came, before rolling his eyes and sauntering off, the sound of his designer boots clicking smugly against the marble. Alone again, Camille inhaled slowly, forcing down the familiar bitterness rising in her throat. She finished her work with mechanical precision, her heart hammering in her chest, and then she pushed her cart into the storage room at the end of the hall. But instead of heading straight back to her assigned rounds, she paused, her gaze falling on the forgotten upright piano tucked away against the wall. It was an old instrument, the wood faded and scratched, one leg slightly uneven, a ghost of music still lingering in its battered frame. For a long moment, she simply stared at it, the cloth still clutched in her hand. Then, as if pulled by an invisible force, she stepped closer, her fingers hovering just above the yellowed keys. No one was around. No students practicing, no instructors patrolling. Only silence, thick and waiting. Camille sat down on the creaking bench, her heart pounding like a drum in her ears. She placed her hands gently on the keys. They felt foreign and yet achingly familiar. Tentatively, she pressed down on a single note. The sound was rough, uneven, but it filled the room like a long-held breath finally released. Another note. Then another. Without thinking, without planning, Camille let her fingers move, stumbling at first, then slowly remembering. She played not from memory, not from technique, but from something deeper. Raw emotion poured into melody, sorrow laced with hope, every missed opportunity, every buried dream finding its voice at last. The piano, though battered and out of tune, responded as if it had been waiting just as long as she had. She was so lost in the music that she didn't hear the footsteps until they were almost beside her. She startled, her hands jerking away from the keys, heart leaping into her throat. "It's okay," a calm voice said. Camille turned to see Marcus Reed, the overnight security guard, standing just inside the doorway, his hands raised in peace. He was a tall man with kind eyes and a demeanor that always made her think of deep waters, steady, unshakable. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, wiping her hands on her uniform as if she could erase the moment. "I wasn't supposed to." "Why not?" Marcus asked gently, stepping closer. "That was beautiful." Camille shook her head, backing away from the piano. "I'm not supposed to be here. I'm nobody." Marcus studied her for a long moment, then said, "There's an audition coming up. The Wellington Prize. They've got a wild card slot. No background check. No credentials. Just talent." Camille let out a dry, disbelieving laugh. "That's for them. The real musicians. Not people like me." "People like you?" Marcus repeated softly. "You mean people who actually have something real to say?" She opened her mouth to protest but found no words. Deep down, she knew the truth. She was afraid. Afraid of stepping into the light only to be shoved back into the shadows. Marcus pulled a small flyer from his pocket and laid it on the piano. "Think about it," he said, and then he was gone, leaving Camille alone once more with the battered upright and a choice she hadn't dared imagine in years. That night, as she cleaned the rehearsal halls and listened to the polished performances drifting through the closed doors, the flawless scales, the showy arpeggios, Camille realized that for all their perfection, none of them had made her heart tremble the way her own halting notes had. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a place for music that wasn't about technique or pedigree. Maybe there was still a place for her. And so, trembling but determined, Camille took the flyer home. By the dim light of her kitchen table, surrounded by unpaid bills and worn-out dreams, she filled out the application form. Name, Camille Harris. Background, self-taught. Piece, original composition, untitled. As she folded the form and slid it into an envelope, her hands were still shaking. But for the first time in years, it wasn't from fear. It was from hope, the kind of fierce, fragile hope that had once made a little girl in Baton Rouge believe she could turn sorrow into song. The envelope felt heavier than it should have as Camille Harris tucked it into her jacket the next morning and walked back through the freezing mist toward the New Haven Conservatory. The stone walls of the old building loomed above her, cold and unyielding, but today, as she pushed open the heavy doors, something inside her had changed. It wasn't courage exactly, more like a stubborn, quiet decision that after years of silence, she would at least give herself permission to be heard once. No one greeted her when she arrived. No one noticed her standing near the registration desk in her gray uniform, holding the envelope like a fragile offering. The students around her, wrapped in tailored coats and carrying polished portfolios, spoke in hushed, confident tones, barely glancing her way. Camille stepped forward. The woman behind the table, wearing an expensive burgundy blazer and a polite, tired smile, looked up with the practiced patience reserved for handling late maintenance requests. Camille placed the envelope carefully on the table. "I'm here to audition," she said, her voice soft but steady. There was a brief flicker of confusion in the woman's eyes, then professional neutrality. She added Camille's name to the bottom of the list, murmured a curt thank you, and turned to the next polished young contestant waiting behind her. Camille stepped back, feeling the stares prick at her skin. A few students looked at her, then at each other, smirking. Charlotte Whitmore, standing nearby in a crisp black dress, made no attempt to hide her disdain as she whispered something to a friend and laughed. Camille kept her eyes on the floor, pretending not to hear. She found a seat near the edge of the lobby, far from the clusters of chatting students, and waited. The hours passed slowly. One by one, names were called. One by one, contestants disappeared behind the heavy double doors to the audition hall, emerging later with varied expressions, some beaming, some crushed, all meticulously groomed to look like they belonged. Camille sat motionless, her calloused hands resting in her lap, her heart pounding a slow, heavy beat against her ribs. When her name was finally called, the room seemed to hush, curiosity sharpening in the air. Camille stood, smoothing her uniform out of habit, and walked toward the door. Whispers trailed behind her like shadows. Who was she? What was she doing here? Had there been some mistake? Inside the audition hall, the light was blinding. The room was vast, with a raised stage at the center where a single Steinway grand piano gleamed under the spotlights. 3 judges sat behind a long table facing the stage, their expressions a mix of boredom and calculation. Dr. Vivian Sloan, at the center, adjusted her reading glasses and peered down at the sheet in front of her. Camille approached the stage, her shoes silent against the polished wood. "Camille Harris?" Dr. Sloan said, her voice clipped and precise. "You'll be performing an original composition, is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am," Camille answered, barely above a whisper. Dr. Sloan's gaze swept over Camille's gray uniform, lingering just a fraction too long. "The Steinway is reserved for formal submissions," she said crisply. She turned to an assistant. "Is there another instrument available?" The assistant, flustered, nodded and pointed to the far corner of the hall where a battered upright piano stood half forgotten against the wall. Its surface was scratched and faded, a missing key glaring from the middle like a chipped tooth. "That will do," Dr. Sloan said, her voice oozing false politeness. Camille felt the humiliation like a slap but said nothing. She walked steadily toward the old piano. Every step felt like dragging the weight of her entire life across the floor. She sat down, closed her eyes for a brief moment, and placed her hands on the keys. The first notes came hesitant, trembling, as if the piano itself were waking from a long, painful sleep. Then, slowly, the sound grew stronger, richer, filling the hall with something that had nothing to do with technical perfection and everything to do with truth. Camille played not from muscle memory but from memory of heart, the long nights in Baton Rouge, the echoes of Lionel Jacobs' smoky jazz, the lullabies hummed by her mother through the thin apartment walls. Her music spoke of empty plates and full hearts, of dreams deferred but never extinguished. The room shifted. Murmurs died away. Even the scribbling of pens stopped. Dr. Sloan's poised pen hovered midair, forgotten. Camille poured everything into the battered piano, her anger, her sorrow, her hope, her joy. Each note was a confession, each chord a cry. When she reached the end, there was no flourish, no grand finale. Just a soft, lingering note that faded into a silence deeper than anything applause could touch. She lifted her hands from the keys and sat still, breathing hard, as if she had climbed a mountain that no one else could see. The silence stretched unbearably long. Then, abruptly, Dr. Sloan leaned back in her chair, her face unreadable. Without a word, she stood and walked to the Steinway. The hall held its breath. She sat at the pristine grand piano and, with impeccable technique, launched into a flawless rendition of Beethoven's Sonata No. 23. The notes were crystal clear, the phrasing textbook perfect. It was music polished to a mirror shine, cold, beautiful, distant. Camille watched without emotion. She understood what was happening. Dr. Sloan wasn't just performing. She was reasserting control, reminding the room of what real music was supposed to sound like. When Dr. Sloan finished, she rose and returned to her seat, smoothing her blazer with practiced elegance. "Thank you, Miss Harris," she said, voice neutral. "That will be all." Camille stood, feeling the blood rush in her ears. She glanced once at the Steinway, then back at the battered upright. Without waiting for permission, she sat down again at the old piano. A murmur rippled through the judges. Camille closed her eyes, placed her hands once more on the chipped keys, and continued her song, not from the beginning, but from where she had left off, as if no interruption had occurred. This time, the notes were different, deeper, rawer, carrying the defiance of someone who had been told to stay silent all her life and had chosen, instead, to sing louder. Dr. Sloane's expression hardened, but she said nothing. Neither did the other judges. They simply listened, transfixed, as Camille's melody wove through the hall like a river carving stone. When she finished for the second time, she rose slowly, nodded once, and walked off the stage without waiting for dismissal. No applause greeted her. Only silence. But it was a silence she recognized, not the silence of dismissal, but the heavy, stunned silence of something real having passed through. 2 days later, Camille was wiping down the practice room windows when Marcus Reed appeared in the hallway, waving a folded piece of paper in the air. She met him at the door, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. Marcus grinned, pressing the paper into her hands. "Finalist list," he said simply. Her heart hammering, Camille unfolded the paper. There, at the very bottom, after the names of students from Juilliard, Curtis, and Eastman, was hers, Camille Harris, wildcard entry. For a moment, she simply stared, not breathing, not blinking. A smile, small but fierce, tugged at her lips. "They saw you," Marcus said, his voice low. "For once, they really saw you." That evening, as Camille walked home through the frozen streets of New Haven, the city lights blurring into soft halos, she clutched the paper to her chest like a promise. The battle wasn't over. Far from it. The finals were coming, and the world was not yet ready to welcome someone like her into their hallowed halls. But for the first time in years, Camille Harris knew one thing for sure: she had something they could never take away. Her music was real. Her voice was real. And whether they liked it or not, they were going to hear it. Camille Harris clutched the finalist list in her hand as she stood beneath the flickering fluorescent light outside the conservatory, the night air sharp against her skin but unable to cool the fire burning inside her. Wildcard entry. 2 simple words printed neatly beside her name, but to Camille, they roared louder than any applause. It wasn't validation she craved, it was the acknowledgement that for once, the world had stopped and truly listened. Yet she knew that making it to the finals was only the beginning. The Wellington Prize was not handed out for heart alone, it demanded mastery, endurance, the ability to stand under scrutiny so intense it could strip the soul bare. As she walked home under the frozen stars, Marcus's words echoed in her mind, "They saw you," but another voice lingered louder, more persistent, more familiar, "Now they'll try to break you." The days leading to the finals blurred into a whirlwind of practice sessions, late nights, and brutal critiques. Dr. Vivian Sloan, ever the icy sentinel of tradition, summoned Camille to private sessions in a spare room of the conservatory, a place where the grand walls muffled emotion and only precision was allowed to exist. Dr. Sloan wasted no time with pleasantries. She dissected Camille's playing with surgical sharpness, pointing out every uneven pedal movement, every reckless deviation from phrasing. "You have emotion," Dr. Sloan said once, her voice flat, "but emotion without discipline is chaos. You will not survive the finals on heart alone." Camille absorbed each criticism like a stone absorbs rain, silent, unmoving on the outside, but with each drop, something inside her shifted, hardened, sharpened. Still, she never allowed herself to be hollowed out. No matter how many times Dr. Sloan demanded she fit into the pristine mold of academic performance, Camille refused to let go of the raw pulse that made her music alive. On the eve of the final competition, Camille sat alone in the small room she rented on the south side of town, the battered upright piano in the corner lit only by a single desk lamp. Her fingers hovered above the keys. She had rehearsed the approved piece Dr. Sloan had suggested, a polished sonata that would meet every expectation. But as her fingers brushed the keys, the old music, the real music, stirred within her, restless, aching to be free. She thought of Baton Rouge, of Lionel Jacobs, of her mother's humming voice, of long nights wiping floors while a symphony of dreams screamed silently inside her. And suddenly Camille knew she could not lie. Not now. Not after coming this far. She would improvise. She would blend jazz, gospel, classical, a tapestry woven from every scar, every hope, every unseen moment of her life. She would risk everything. The morning of the finals dawned cold and clear, the sun glinting off the ice-crusted sidewalks as Camille made her way to the conservatory. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with an electric tension, the air thick with the perfume of nerves and ambition. Contestants in black suits and glittering dresses flitted through the halls, their laughter brittle, their smiles too sharp. Charlotte Whitmore stood in a corner, surrounded by admirers, her polished appearance flawless, her confidence radiating like a beacon. Camille walked past them unnoticed, her worn shoes squeaking faintly against the marble. She didn't need their recognition. She had something better, the truth humming under her skin, ready to be unleashed. Backstage, as the final contestants waited, Camille sat silently against the wall, her hands folded in her lap. Landon Mercer strolled by, offering a pointed smirk, but she didn't even flinch. Marcus appeared briefly, a thermos of coffee in hand, and offered her a silent nod, the kind of gesture that said everything words could not. Then the call came. Contestants were ushered onto the stage one by one, their performances met with polite applause, a few murmurs of approval. Charlotte Whitmore played a flawless Rachmaninoff, her fingers dancing like a machine crafted for precision, her face a perfect mask of emotion manufactured for effect. The audience responded with admiration, as expected. Camille listened from the wings, feeling none of the envy she once feared would cripple her. She wasn't here to compete against them. She was here to speak the language that had been denied her for so long. When her name was finally announced, Camille Harris, wildcard entry, the applause was hesitant, scattered. She walked onto the stage, the lights burning down upon her, the grand Steinway gleaming like a mirror into another world. Camille wore no gown, no sparkling jewelry, just a simple navy blue dress and the old bracelet her mother had given her, a thin silver band etched with tiny notes. She sat at the piano, placed her hands on the keys, and closed her eyes. For a moment, the entire hall held its breath. And then she began. The first notes were soft, tentative, like a memory stirring from sleep. A simple gospel chord progression that spiraled upward into a jazz-influenced melody, a heartbeat syncopated with pain and hope. Her left hand laid down a foundation of bluesy sorrow, her right hand soared with improvisational leaps, daring and tender at once. Camille built her music the way her life had been built, unplanned, uneven, but undeniably real. The audience sat frozen, the judges rigid in their seats, pens forgotten on the table. Halfway through, she shifted gears. A sudden classical cadence threaded into the gospel structure, creating tension that crackled in the air. She wasn't showing off. She wasn't performing for approval. She was telling them, "This is who I am." The child who grew up tracing piano keys in the air because she couldn't afford lessons. The janitor who cleaned the stages where others played. The woman who had loved music too much to let it die inside her. As Camille neared the end, she let the music spiral higher, pushing it beyond convention into a place where sorrow became beauty, where brokenness became strength. She struck a final, suspended chord, an unresolved, aching note that hung in the air like a prayer, and then slowly lifted her hands from the keys. Silence. Not awkwardness. Not confusion. Reverence. For a long moment, no one moved. No one dared breathe. Then, from the back of the hall, a single pair of hands began to clap. Then another. And another. The applause grew, swelling into a standing ovation that rolled forward like a wave, unstoppable and pure. Camille stood, her body trembling not with fear but with release. She bowed her head slightly, not as a submission but as a quiet thank you to the dream she had refused to bury. Back at the judge's table, Dr. Vivian Sloane sat motionless, her face unreadable. Then, slowly, deliberately, she placed her pen down, stood, and joined the applause. It wasn't just respect. It was surrender. An acknowledgement that there are truths no conservatory curriculum can teach, no pedigree can manufacture. Later that evening, as the audience and contestants gathered for the award ceremony, Camille stood at the far edge of the auditorium, her heart strangely calm. When the host took the stage and began announcing the winners, Camille barely listened. It didn't matter anymore. She had played her truth. She had been heard. But when the words came, the winner of this year's Wellington Prize, for a performance that redefined the meaning of artistry, is Camille Harris, it struck her like a lightning bolt, stunning in its finality. The applause roared around her again, louder than before, shaking the rafters. Camille walked to the stage slowly, her feet steady, her spirit soaring. Dr. Sloane met her at the podium, the award plaque in hand. For the first time, there was no condescension in her eyes. Only quiet awe. "You proved me wrong," Dr. Sloane said softly, so that only Camille could hear. Camille smiled, her hand firm as she accepted the award. "No," she replied just as softly. "I just finally told my story." 1 year later, Camille stood once again on the grand stage of the New Haven Conservatory, but this time not as a janitor or a wildcard contestant. She was the featured opening performer of the Wellington Prize ceremony, her name printed in bold on every program, her story etched into every hopeful heart in the audience. She sat at the Steinway once more, her fingers resting gently on the keys, and when she played, the music wasn't just hers, it belonged to everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, everyone who had ever been silenced, everyone who still dared to dream. In the audience, among the new generation of students and dreamers, a young girl with dark skin and bright eyes clutched a notebook filled with her own unfinished songs, looking up at Camille with a spark of belief. Camille smiled as she played, because she understood now that the greatest symphony she would ever write wasn't made of notes or chords, it was the quiet revolution of a heart that refused to be silenced. Years of being overlooked, mocked, and dismissed. Camille didn't win because she played by the rules others set for her. She won because she stayed true to the voice inside her that refused to die, even when the world tried to silence it. There's a powerful lesson here for all of us. Your worth isn't measured by the labels society tries to give you. You don't need a perfect resume to be valuable. You don't need an expensive education or an elite network to make your voice matter. What you need is the courage to speak, or to play, honestly from your soul, even if your hands are rough, even if the keys are chipped, even if the world isn't ready to listen. Camille taught us that talent doesn't always wear a tuxedo or carry a degree. Sometimes, it wears a faded uniform and carries the weight of 1,000 unseen battles. And sometimes, when that talent finally finds the courage to step into the light, it changes everything, not just for itself, but for everyone who has ever been told they weren't enough. So if you're sitting quietly on a dream, thinking it's too late, too impossible, or too out of reach, don't believe that lie. Dust off that dream. Tune the old piano. Write the story. Paint the canvas. Build the vision. And when you do, don't do it to prove anyone wrong. Do it to honor the music that has lived inside you all along. Because the world doesn't need more polished perfection. It needs more truth. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Here at US Daily Story, we believe in telling the stories that matter, the quiet battles, the unseen heroes, the voices that deserve to be heard. If Camille's story touched you, we hope you'll carry it with you and maybe, just maybe, let it push you a little closer to your own dreams. Please don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs a little encouragement today, and subscribe to US Daily Story for more inspiring and powerful stories from everyday lives that prove greatness isn't given, it's claimed. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, sometimes, the most extraordinary symphonies are born in the silence the world tried to ignore.